What strategy will Putin choose if Trump enforces sanctions? Will the American president manage to win the Nobel Prize next year? And what is more important for real politics, values or interests? My guest today is Jason Smart, political advisor and analyst who deals with post-Soviet politics and global security. I'm glad to see you here in our studio, Jason.
Great to see you today.
Yeah, and US NATO envoy Matthew Whitaker said that Trump will enforce oil sanctions on Russia to pressure Vladimir Putin into negotiations on Russia-Ukraine war. And I would like to ask you, what approach will Putin choose after new sanctions, concessions or escalation?
I think that the reality is that Vladimir Putin today is in a very difficult situation. His economy is falling apart very quickly, and they're desperate for liquidity. The banks in Russia have a huge liquidity crisis right now. The thing that props up the ruble is foreign currency, the dollars, the euros, the yuan from China. But with the lack of that, it'll make things much more complicated for the Kremlin going forward. So what will happen? Well, let's remember this. 80% of Russia's oil is bought by China and India. And if those countries are actually pressured by the United States, by Trump, to not buy the oil, and that's successful, that's a huge blow to Russia. 40 to 45% of their national budget actually is related to the sale of oil and gas. So that's a major point. Now, Putin, though, is then put into a very complicated situation in the sense that he has no other options. Russia doesn't produce anything else really that people buy externally. You know, people don't go to their house and look around what they have. Who has a refrigerator from Russia or clothes from Russia? There's really very little that is exported from Russia. So how else can they get foreign currency? They easily cannot. And that's why I think that today Putin is hoping that there will be escalation elsewhere. For instance, in Venezuela, where we've seen an increase of tension with the United States over what is occurring there. I think that Vladimir Putin would like to see that become a really hot issue, because then it would distract the Americans from Ukraine and would change the world's attention to a different region. That might be something that he hopes to be able to balance his situation, because right now it's becoming rapidly unbalanced.
But actually, do you believe in any concessions from Putin?
I don't think there will be any concessions for Putin. Putin has not shown a history of being very interested in concessions. A report from NBC yesterday indicated that the U.S. intelligence community does not believe that Vladimir Putin is sincere about negotiations, and he has no intention of ending the war. The CIA said a year and a half ago exactly the same thing. We've seen no change whatsoever in Vladimir Putin's position. So why he would think that there would be a change now, I see no evidence for that. Keep in mind, Putin also believed that by October 15th, that Russian troops would take the rest of Donetsk Oblast. They've still failed to do that. So it's hard to tell what is really going on. Does Vladimir Putin not fully understand what is occurring, how bad it is for his military, or is he just arrogant and he thinks he'll get away with it? In either case, he's not in a good situation. Because if he doesn't realize how bad his situation is, he'll just make things worse because he doesn't appreciate the real circumstance he faces. But if he does realize how bad it is, then it's just lunacy, because he has no possibility of moving ahead. After a summer offensive that cost over 200,000 Russian soldiers' lives, killed or injured, he's gained less than 1% of the territory of Ukraine. Why would he think continuing now with a weakened economy, things will improve? About half of Russians today, 48%, say that they are looking for a second job due to their economic situation. About 93% of those people say they cannot find a second job. The real reason for that is actually high inflation. When you see extremely low unemployment, like we see in Russia today, it's about 2%, 2.2%, that's not indicative of a great economy. It's indicative of the fact that there's hyperinflation that's starting to get worse. The Russian economy is overheating, and the government now has taken out so much money, so much liquidity from the banking sector and from private businesses that today there's a real problem. How are they going to pay that back? How are they going to keep this going? Well, they're printing money. But the more you print money, the worse your inflation gets. It doesn't get better. As the U.S. Treasury Secretary said, the real inflation in Russia is probably closer to 20% or more. Now, if you look at the estimates that came out last year by Professor Hankey at Johns Hopkins University, his estimate was closer to 26% inflation in Russia. Now, they've only kept their key interest rate lower than that. As you know, they've continued to keep moving it down to stimulate the economy. But what that's actually doing, it's allowing the inflation to get worse and worse and worse. So that's a very long way to answer what you asked. What will Putin do in this case? Well, given the fact they'll have less hard currency from the West, that will worsen the situation with inflation and it'll make it harder to wage war. Ultimately, I think that's why we're getting to a very crucial point in this entire war. The Kremlin at this point is becoming actually unstable due to what is occurring. And it's been destabilized, is a better way to phrase that. Because if we look at what is happening in the Kremlin, what Putin is doing, look at what he's been doing recently. Increasingly spending time in Valdai. He doesn't want to be seen in the public. Increasingly, he is hidden from the public. He's also behaving differently than he used to behave at public forums. We see that there's something happening within the Kremlin. There's a lot of pressure there. We can't be sure exactly what it is, but we can look back in history to know that the chance that something would happen that's dramatic, that would end this war, like a coup, is quite reasonable to believe. Remember when Prigozhin and the Wagner Group started going towards Moscow and they stopped off in Rostov, what happened? The police didn't stop Prigozhin. The military didn't stop Prigozhin. The National Guard didn't stop Prigozhin. The Chechens didn't stop Prigozhin. The border guards didn't stop Prigozhin. But even more importantly, the local people of Russia did not stop Prigozhin. They came to the streets and greeted him and his soldiers like heroes. They brought them food, they brought them wine, and they thanked them. So that shows you how the Russian population feels about the current situation. That's very important. If you're somebody who's looking at Putin, who's 73 years old now, as of October 7th, he is somebody who is in a situation that is a very bad one for a dictator. People know he's weak. People know he's the weakest he's been in years. And they also know that he will eventually die. So if you're smart and you realize that, the wisest thing you could do, given that there's different oligarchical classes in Russia and clans that fight with each other, is to liquidate him yourself so that you could take power. Because eventually he will die. To just wait for that to happen is totally unwise. Game theory would indicate the wisest thing that you could do is to operate in your interest while you have the opportunity to do so before somebody else does. And that's why I think that today, Vladimir Putin's entire regime is much closer to a collapse, or him doing something totally radical to try to save himself from that, than it's been in years. I think that's why he's talking more about these things like nuclear weapons recently. It's really for the internal purpose, more than external. I don't think it's really for the West, because we know what his capacities are. It's not for that. It's really different. It's about the fact that within Russia, he's worried about losing control.
What Putin will do on the front line in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, but in Europe, because we know these provocations from Russia in Europe.
The reality is that I don't think much will really change in real terms. Putin is already doing everything that's illegal necessary. I mean, from the very beginning, invading a foreign country is illegal in international law. We don't have the declaration of war and these things. It is illegal to go start a war against another country. So we've already gone past that. At this point, his troops also engage in obviously the torture of prisoners and not taking prisoners of war or torturing them, the use of chemicals and the use of gas, all these different things that are already against the law. So at this point, what else will he do against the law? I don't think he really has any limits. Now, the argument I think against why he would probably not use a nuclear weapon is pretty clear. There's two different things that he would lose with that really quickly. One is the fact that it seems that he's gotten a lot of pressure from India and China to not do so. If he were to lose their support totally, that will be the end of his regime. And that will collapse the Russian Federation. That is an extremely bad idea. So that's probably not what he's going to do. But there's a second part of that, which is the Russians, for every nuclear weapon, the cost per year to maintain it, it's millions of dollars. It's not cheap. To make sure it's up to date, it's kept well. As far as we can tell, the Russians have embezzled most of the money that was spent on anything in their military. So whether or not they were actually checking their weapons for the past 35 years, I would seriously question that. Are they really meeting the standards that they should? I'd be surprised if they are. So let's imagine he used a nuclear weapon. Russia, in its long-term strategy, realizes that its threat is not Ukraine or the West, it's China. China is the country that really, in the long term, in 100 years from now, they're not going to be worried about Ukraine. They're worried about what China will do. But that's just the problem. If you use a nuclear weapon, let's imagine it doesn't work, it malfunctions, because you haven't had the maintenance for it. Then what do you do with China? China now realizes that you cannot actually use your ACE card. You no longer have the ability to actually stop them. You've just showed them, in front of the whole world, that they're impotent. And at this point, that's when China would have the ability to take advantage of you like never before.
Could you provide us any time frames when Putin will be ready to stop and make some deal with Kyiv, with Washington?
From the beginning of this in 2022, I've always believed that there would never be an agreement with Putin. And I also believe that the military solution to this, the physically pushing Russia out of the country, was unrealistic just due to the size of Russia, the fact that they don't care how many soldiers die, they'll just keep going. And even if you push them all out, what stops them from coming the next day back? The way that this will end, I've argued since 2022, is when the Putin regime collapses. And that's why ultimately the best thing that can happen is attacks within Russia. The single best thing that can happen is that. So Ukraine, for instance, let's look at what's happening here. Russia's in an impossible situation. They've tried to invade a country. They're obviously failing at doing so. And they're not making any advances. And the thing that they use is a war of attrition, which historically works because you have more people in your country than your neighbors have in their country. So you can afford to lose more of them, and eventually you'll be able to push through. But that doesn't work when you're no longer directly engaging with your enemy. When you're having hand-to-hand combat like this, it makes sense because you'll eventually just physically overwhelm them. But today, when you're using something like drones, they never get to the point of able to directly conflict. And when you're using things like HIMARS to destroy whole groups of them at one time from a long distance, it means no longer does Russia's strategy that's worked for hundreds of years currently work. And that's why Russia today is in an impossible situation. It won't get better for them. But the Russians probably will not admit that, and Putin won't admit that, and that's why he'll probably continue to push as he's doing now. But there's a second part of this which is very important. I think that Vladimir Putin would not want to see an end to the war. I think he would understand it to be strategically unwise, because simply, if all those soldiers came back to Russia unemployed and with weapons and very unhappy, I don't think it would work out very well for him. I think he realizes that is actually what can destabilize his country. That is a very dangerous scenario. Keep in mind, they've arrested the conflict between the FSB right now and the military in Russia. It's got much worse. They've arrested 17 generals in the Russian military. Just this morning, they sentenced another general from the Rosgvardia to 9 years in prison. But you just look, all these generals arrested. You know how many generals were arrested in the United States, the UK, France, and Canada combined in the last 5 years? 0. But Russia keeps arresting them. Why? Because the FSB is worried about revolts from the military. There are serious controls problems that they have right now with the internal stability of Russia.
You believe in this scenario, yeah?
I think that the best case scenario is that we see the collapse of the Putin regime, which is why the attacks on oil refineries and as well as on the factories in Russia is so very important. If we destroy the economic means of Russia to continue, it's the most realistic way to win and the most efficient way. That's why Ukraine, I think, is strategically much wiser. If Russia has to, its objective is what? It's to take Ukraine. Okay, that means it physically has to take territory. But we see that's not working very well. Ukraine doesn't have to do that. Ukraine can allow Russia to take a little piece of territory because it knows it can get it back. Its objective is to preserve the lives of its soldiers so they can delay this because the Russians, eventually, their economy will collapse. Eventually, the political system will collapse. And in that case, that will cause the end of the war. There's 3 different things that a war can end on. It's either due to military defeat, or it's due to political collapse, or it's due to economic collapse. And in this case, I think that it's strategically wisest to aim for economic and political collapse, which is what I've said since 2022. That's realistic within Russia. The country is not a stable society. If we force a break of Russia, that is the cleanest way, and it also guarantees future security for Ukraine.
Okay, let's talk about the American president. Donald Trump seems to be obsessed when it comes to the Nobel Prize. And the next Nobel Prize presentation will take place on October 2026. And actually one more significant event will take place, but not in October, in November 2026. It is midterm elections. And I'm pretty sure that both of these events are very important for Donald Trump. And I would like to ask you, you know that it's easier to win both for Trump thanks to Russia-Ukraine war resolution. And in your opinion, what will be stronger, Trump's desire to win both this event, or Putin's KGB tricks as praise, admiration, lie, etc. And on the other hand, we know that Putin use one more tool. It's about nuclear pressure, nuclear threat, and I would say nuclear blackmail. What will be stronger for Trump? His desire to win these both events, or Putin?
I think, Trump's desire to win these awards, it's true. It sounds funny, but it's true. I think that is what motivates him for a lot of what he does. And as a result of that, I think that that's probably the only thing he really cares about. I don't think that Putin's regime can really continue for another year. I'd be really surprised if they could. Due to the economic pressure, due to the military pressure, it's going to be very difficult for them to do that. So, either way, I think that Donald Trump would view it as a victory for himself if this continues and he sees that Putin is unwilling to give him his Nobel Peace Prize, that is to say that he's unwilling to make a deal. Just looking at the history of Donald Trump throughout his life, he seems like a very vengeful person. He seems like a person who likes to get revenge if somebody displeases him. And I can imagine that in this situation. And it's not because he has something personal against Putin right now. He definitely, obviously, I think has probably a positive opinion of Putin, but rather because he views it as costing him this award. But if the Putin regime were to fall, there would also be a conclusion to the war. And if he can somehow take credit for that, it's better than the war continuing, because that would be very hard for him to get his Nobel Peace Prize, which in either case, I think it's highly improbable that he'll win it. But either way, that's his objective, so we can try to analyze it.
All these military drills with launching nuclear missiles, Буревестник, Poseidon, Yars, etc. What do you think when it comes to nuclear threat? Is it bluff, or Putin is crazy enough to use it?
I think that As of now, it's bluff just because it runs too much of a risk. He doesn't know if the nuclear weapons are going to work. If they don't work, then it will cost him a lot more than it would have. That'd be really a disaster for him. That would probably trigger a coup. That would actually probably trigger his death. So I think that that's probably why he would not do that. Now, that being said, I don't think that he would have a problem with it from an ethical standpoint, but what would it really gain? Let's think about a battlefield. Imagine a nuclear blast. Imagine he's using a small load nuclear weapon. What would he physically be able to do? The lines in Ukraine are such that there's enough distance between them. You blow up a small area, but then your soldiers do what? They go through this area that's now radiated, and they pass through, and they go to where? They make it to Kyiv? No, they still have several more lines to go through before they get to Kyiv. But let's imagine, okay, he attacks Kyiv like this. What would he gain from this as well? So he destroys Kyiv. The international community at that point, including the Chinese, including the Indians, would undoubtedly cut him off. And at that point, it would be a very rapid decline of Russia. It would not take much time. It would be, I think, within hours, we would start to see serious problems with the Kremlin.
Yeah, but you are talking about tactical nuclear weapon, and I'm talking about strategic nuclear weapon.
Fine. If he uses a nuclear weapon in, let's say, Kyiv, I don't think it would change anything for him. How does that advance his cause? It doesn't win the war. It doesn't end it in a real sense. At that point, though, it would definitely cut off any of the international support that he currently has, which would cause him to lose the war. It would be a very strategically unwise decision. I just don't see what he would actually gain. Like, he threatens this, okay, but Russia's been threatening this for how many decades now? In the Soviet Union, they threatened this too. Khrushchev threatened the same thing. Okay, so many years, and how many nuclear weapons have they used? I don't worry about it. The fact is this, is that they know that they have a lot more to lose than to gain. But just to ask yourself this, pragmatically. Okay, let's imagine he wants to use a nuclear weapon. Where would you use it, and what would the objective be? What would you achieve specifically? Like, it has to have an objective. To do what? I can't imagine what that objective would be. Yeah,
but actually he can be irrational. And I'm asking you, is he capable of launching these nuclear missiles to Washington, for instance, or to Brussels?
Once again, what would he gain from that? Well, let's imagine that it failed. There would then be a nuclear attack, second strike attack, that would then come down immediately on Moscow. The Americans clearly know where he's located. The U.S. intelligence community, we have to understand, is so far beyond advanced compared to the Russians. So there's a statistic I read one time. Actually, it was an event, was if the U.S. had the desire to sink all of Russia's nuclear submarines, it could be done within an hour. None of them would realize it was about to happen, and they'd all be dead. And we'd wipe out their naval headquarters at the same time. So that would stop them from having any way to retaliate directly with that. But then we could very quickly, we know where he's located, so actually physically make sure that he is dead and his family, that's not very difficult.
Thanks to recent Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff's interview, we more clearly understood the political approach of Trump's team. I mean that they focus on interests over values, sometimes. My question is, in your opinion, what will save democratic world and security architecture, values or interests?
Well, ultimately, I think the democratic world is all about, ultimately, it's not really values. I do think it's about interests, because ultimately the voters are voting for their own self-interest typically. They're not voting for values. Despite what voters say, they're voting out of self-interest. But they're also voting out of emotion. 80% of voter decisions coming from emotion, not out of reason. So let's think of this first. So what does that really mean? Well, that means that somebody that has a common values, and when the Americans say values, we talked about in the Cold War when they'd say values, what do they really mean by that? Yeah, they mean democracy and these things, but they also mean the free enterprise of corporations. That's very important. But corporations don't really have values, they have interest, right? So when they say, what is the free market? What is that? What is democracy? It means that the corporations can operate as they want to in a free society. And I think that's really, is that values, or is that really more about interest? In which case, I don't know. I think that we're perhaps using a euphemism. It sounds nice to say values, but in fact,